All right, and welcome in. This is another edition of the CISO Sandbox video and podcast presented by Hawkson. I'm Elliot Baker. With me, it is my great pleasure to have Gary Hayslip and Bill Bonney. Guys, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you here. So this is a special edition of the Hawks Hunt CISO Sandbox because this ties back into naturally cybersecurity and maybe a little bit more unexpectedly fantasy football. So Gary and Bill were part of an amazing group of security leaders who joined me in a fantasy football league, and with the simple idea being, can you learn something about cybersecurity from fantasy football? And I think as the season went on, we had a pretty lively chat group, and there's some pretty fun lessons being shared, some fun metaphors, and others. The highs and the lows of rooting for your own fantasy football team and your own pro football team. And through all of that, folks, we have ourselves a honest to goodness fantasy football champion, and I believe his first year playing fantasy football, Bill Bonney. So Bill, maybe we'll start with you. Congratulations on the championship. And
thank you.
Yeah, go ahead and maybe tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and then just go right into a little bit about what you thought of the fantasy football experience and the Phish Bowl.
Okay, sure, you bet. I'm still Bill Bonney. I started my career on the IT services delivery side, so was kind of on the CIO track for the first half. Did some consulting around the .com explosion, and then after it did explode, came back into industry, but came in cybersecurity. So I spent the second real half of my career in cybersecurity. Most of that I worked for Intuit, folks that make TurboTax and QuickBooks, and ran a number of the programs over there. I retired from the corporate world back in 2014. And now I help run a company with Gary and our other co-author, Matt Stamper, and we write books that are targeted to leadership within the cybersecurity community. More governance type books than practitioner books, although we do have a few books for practitioners as well. So that's primarily what I do these days. The fantasy football was interesting because, I think, Elliot, as you'll recall, you had to kind of drag me into it. I'd never done it before, and I really wasn't sure what kind of time commitment it was going to take. And the first month of the season, I was just simply unavailable. I had a lot of travel, I had family visiting, and I wasn't even able to participate in the draft. So I'm like, well, all right, draft me a team, and I guess I'll come in last place or something like that. So what was interesting though, there was some jargon I had to figure out. I mean, I actually had to ask people what some of the acronyms on the dashboard even meant, because these are things that y'all have been using for so long that it's just common to you. I'm looking at these things going, what in the heck? So learned what was going on, and then had a lot more fun than I thought I was going to have. So I really appreciate the fact that you stuck with it, Elliot, and dragged me one way or another into the program. It was fun.
Oh, it was my pleasure. And also, Bill, I really appreciated the different thought leadership contributions you had throughout the season too. So part of the idea of the Phish Bowl is that we'd have weekly thought leadership articles or interviews. And Bill, you had a really interesting one that was tied into automation, which we'll kind of come back to here. But the draft robot drafted some people really well. And Gary, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how the draft robot treated you.
I'm Gary Hayslip. And the draft robot really screwed me over. The thing about it is you think in cyber, you go and you use automation to make things better. You use automation to have better visibility. You use automation, to be able to manage even like large scale, issues with small teams. I can honestly say, I don't know what the hell the draft bot was drafting this year, but I could not get a tight end to save my butt. I mean, it was crazy. I couldn't get anybody. And it wasn't even halfway through the year that I finally started actually scoring some points. But even then, some of the teams you go against, I'm lucky to get 85 points and they're scoring 140. And I'm just like, I kind of felt like I was a Pop Warner team playing, a pro team. I mean, you guys are just killing me. It was pretty rough this year. I have to admit.
It was a pretty competitive league too. So some of the people who were in there, myself included, have been doing this for over 20 years. I think Jarek Beeson, Capital One, he drafted a great team, had a whole kind of an intriguing strategy to how he drafted and managed his team week to week. Larry Whiteside also is an long-time player. Then other people are sort of a little more casual. So what was impressive about your team, Gary, is that you never gave up. I think you started 0-5 and clawed your way back to, I think, a 6-6 record, so that you were right there in the playoff hunt all the way to the end. So maybe talking a little bit about going from automation to when you started to manage it, just, change your strategy a little bit, it sounded like, and if there's any tie into cybersecurity there.
Yeah, what I ended up doing was, it's just, you start, I guess for me, once you had a couple of games in, you start having enough numbers, you start having enough data to start comparing. So I started comparing, a lot of the different players, so I could start making choices as to who I was going to select or who I was going to swap out. And then I started paying attention to, hey, okay, this guy is a running back, but he's playing the number 2 defense or the number 3 defense. Well, his numbers are probably going to be pretty low. Let's put people in that are playing like the number 25 defense or the number 27 defense. I was kind of looking at that. So I started really paying attention, to the data, and that allowed me again to go ahead and, as you said, start clawing back and getting into it. And I mean, from a cyber standpoint, I do think many of us, when we first start out, you're kind of following the numbers. Hey, I need a firewall, I need AV, I need all these different pieces. But the longer you do this, the more you've run teams, the more you've built out security stacks. It is about paying attention to the numbers. It is about paying attention to, even after you get something established and running, I look at networks as almost like living, breathing things in a way, and they will tell you stuff about how they're being used and about issues that are on them if you listen, if you look at the data, if you pay attention. And in both of those, I find you do really well if you just don't go ahead and stay with your blinders on, but you kind of open up and look at all the stuff that's available out there, and you can start putting things together to basically improve.
Yeah, well said. It's part of it. What do they say? It's not just the X's and the O's. It's also the Jims and Joes out there looking at like who are the people involved, what are the data, taking the data-driven approach, seeing the risks between these different matchups and whatnot, and it paid off. And yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Well, I was just going to, basically build on that same point around data. I mean, one of the reasons I was hesitant to come into a fantasy football league is because, I follow the Dallas Cowboys. That happens to be the team I follow. And it's really about the only team I know much about. Just simply because I don't have the same kind of time I used to have when I was younger to watch football. And I've never done fantasy football before, which actually builds in a certain discipline for understanding how the players across the entire league perform, right? So without that, I was completely dependent on the analytics that were being provided by the football platform, right? So I absolutely stayed away from making any gut choices at all until about the 12th or 13th week in the season, when it was down to, well, all right, I've got 2 guys on bye, I've got 3 guys who are injured, there's nobody left on the waivers, I'm going to have to go with this guy. Turns out they did pretty well, but I purposely stayed away from using my gut and relied on the analytics very early on. And I think that's something that we kind of lose sight of sometimes within cybersecurity. We get kind of complacent and we just kind of do things the way they've been done. But going back and actually looking at what's really happening and adjusting your protection posture based on what's happening is a skill. It's a discipline that we need to keep practicing. And I think that's the biggest kind of lesson learned from a automation versus management perspective that I took out of the fantasy football is get that discipline of trusting your numbers back and make sure that you have those numbers, that you're actually monitoring the right things, so that when you go to try to figure out why am I seeing this, you've got data that you can rely on, as opposed to now we've got to go try to figure out how we're going to get that data.
Yeah, so I think that now we can just kind of stay within that topic that you just brought up there, Bill, because that's super important. And I would love to kind of probe that a bit more. So how do you get that visibility? What data are you looking for? How do you get that data to get that visibility into your areas of risk and your vulnerabilities, and how you can, and find ways to fix those problemed areas, particularly at the human layer?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a combination of the monitoring that you're doing and understanding your internal threat environment and applying internal threat intelligence against what you're seeing as that data monitoring is producing, reams of data for you. Being able to interpret the reports that you have based on your analysis of your internal threat intel. And then, obviously juxtaposed against external threat intel, certainly you wouldn't want to ignore that, but really having a good understanding of what you can learn from your own network when you go to look at what's going on, and doing that work, that threat modeling and that threat intel work up front, so that when the data starts to go in one particular direction or another, you've already kind of developed a theory around why. So that you can look at it and kind of apply that lens. Gary, I know you've done an awful lot of work around that area as well. I'd love to hear your thought.
Yeah, I kind of look at it as it's all tied into hygiene. When you're building a security stack, when you're building a team, you're going to inventory what you have. You're going to figure out what's important to the business. You're going to talk to the other departments and look at the technologies they're using, and what they're doing for the company. A lot of them are actually generating revenue, so you're going to have to support them, not get in their way. You pull all these pieces together, you've got your current security stack that you're monitoring. You'll see areas that, things need to be changed, so you have more visibility, or, you need to change things so you can integrate, so you can make decisions faster. And then as you start putting these things together, as Bill alluded to, you start bringing in threat intel that applies to the technology you have. You bring in intelligence that applies for the vertical that you're in, for the business, for what you're doing, and all of this data starts painting a picture. It starts painting a picture of what a healthy stack should look like, the threats that you're facing, what data you should be receiving is, provided you have no incidents or you have no, active malware, anything that's going on. And then when you do have one of these issues, obviously it's a different picture. The data is skewed. Like, hey, that's not supposed to be there. Why is that happening? And you start threat hunting and you start pulling stuff out. And the nice thing is once you have that kind of picture of what's the norm, because of the intel and the stuff that you've built, it actually becomes a very good template for training your staff. For training your staff of this is what good looks like, or what good should look like. And so when you start seeing those outliers, you start seeing where the data starts getting skewed, something's causing that. And it's either you've got malware or, bad guys in the wire, or it's, because of the fact that the business has changed. And now the data that you're seeing, the SaaS apps that you're seeing, a lot of that stuff is shifted, and maybe you didn't realize that. And so now you've got to shift with the business. So, like I said, I spend a lot of that, as Bill was talking about, you spend a lot of that time pulling in those various different data feeds just so you know what known good looks like. And then you use that to be able to train your staff. And then from that, you're able to start threat hunting. You're able to start, being able to see, where things are bad, per se, so you can start triaging.
The other, and what I would build on a little bit there is that, the people aspect of things is pretty important too. And you alluded to it earlier, Gary, with training your staff. And I think that goes beyond just your security team. I certainly don't ever want to be a Pollyanna around how much people will participate in threat defense because they've gone through awareness training. Some will, some won't. But it doesn't need to be a ton of people. It can be a relatively small number of people who become a little bit more aware and are willing to talk about what they're experiencing. And having that access to some people who are experiencing things and willing to say, yes, I saw this, and that might actually give you the clue as to what to go try to track down. If somebody is seeing a phishing attack that they've never seen before and was willing to actually say something about it and your filters weren't catching it, that might be an area to look at. You're not going to know that unless you're actually got people, at least some of them, who are willing to actually participate in threat protection. And some are. I mean, we used to conduct, obviously, we all conduct awareness training. And, a lot of people will do it because they have to. But there are those earnest people who do it, learn what they can learn, and then actually actively participate in the overall, security posture of the company. And that's a huge win.
Yeah. And Gary, maybe you can, I hadn't anticipated talking about this today, but when Bill, you were talking about how there are these threats, these different kinds of human targeted attacks that get through all your technical protections. They're designed to do that. They were socially engineered to do that. And I'm just going down the rabbit hole on ChatGPT and OpenAI. And I'm curious if that's something that you guys are talking about now. And if that's something that you're getting, I'm not sure what we can do at this point in terms of hardening the human layer, but is that something that do you anticipate that being something that's going to make these phishing attacks come through the technical protections even more?
Well, my thing is, I don't believe in the doom and gloom and that, ChatGPT is going to make phishing so bad, because my thing is as soon as, the cyber criminals and stuff figure out something new, that becomes a reason for a new startup, or that becomes a reason for a new innovation.
Right.
So it's kind of this push and pull, type of thing. Right now I'm seeing from ChatGPT, I'm seeing from an innovative standpoint, there's people that, in startups that are figuring out how to use it and what to do with it. And just as I am sure that in some of the cyber criminal organizations, they're looking at, hey, how do we use this tool to better implement or to better build malware or to better build attacks? My thing is that you got to do continuous training. It's hygiene. I mean, we'll go ahead and we do our annual training, and then we do quarterly brown bag trainings. And then my quarterly brown bag trainings is where we go ahead and we do actually hands-on types of trainings where, if we're doing the quarterly training on BEC on phishing attacks, I will go ahead and take multiple types of phish that we have seen over the last quarter that are real, that we've seen within our organization, and I'll walk them through. We're all in a Zoom or whatever type of meeting, and I'll walk them through and point out to them the aspects of what this looks like and what to look for. And if we get them in SMS messages, or if we get them in fake voicemails, the same thing. We will play them and walk them through. So our staff get trained in not just the sitting here and watching a video, but actually a give and take in a discussion live, that this is what it looks like, this is what to watch for. And then I always try to bring in, as Bill was saying, the social engineering piece also. This is why they're doing this, because they want to hurry you up. They want to make you feel anxious that you got to click on something, that you got to make a decision. And then I constantly tell them all the time, it's okay to step back. If your gut feeling says this isn't right, ask the question. That's what we're here for. My team and I are here to go ahead and to help you with this. And oh, by the way, not just here at work, but also at home. If you've got a question, because with people working from home now, I've got to think of home networks that, my corporate assets are going to be riding on as well. your teenager may have gone ahead and clicked on something from TikTok or clicked on something, from their PlayStation and downloaded this SBK, and the next thing you know, the home network's infected. If you've got questions, be free to ask. So I constantly tell them at the end of each of the trainings, it's okay if you see things that you don't think are right, you've got a resource to come ask. And then I tell them, I said, and it's okay to ask your boss as well. I can tell you he or she is more than happy that you would ask the question, Vice, it's probably going to be okay. And then you find out later, whoops, I made a mistake. I probably shouldn't have clicked on that, or I probably shouldn't have, downloaded, that attachment, into that app or whatever. So.
How hard was that for you to establish? So thank you for that answer. That's great. And it sounds like you've established a culture, some kind of a culture where there's a sense of safety, where people can talk to you and the security team. How did you do that? And was awareness part of establishing that culture?
Yeah, it was. We had already, had built it into the training, and it was already doing, a lot of the brown bag sessions. And I have to give SoftBank credit. The culture was already here. They were already doing these types of trainings for compliance and for legal and stuff like that as well. I just went ahead and just piggybacked information security right into the middle of that and said, hey, we're going to do that. We're going to join you guys. And so I leveraged, the culture that was already here. And what I did was, I talked to the head of compliance and them and started introducing them, to like the FBI rep here in San Francisco and different people where they could get training. And so we just slowly started, interweaving information security into all the different trainings and stuff that we were doing. So we just leveraged the culture that was already in place.
Yeah, I could build on that a little bit. One of the things that impressed me when I went to Intuit back in 2005 was the real sense throughout the entire company for people doing the right thing. And it's very easy to build a good cyber hygiene around a predisposition to always want to do the right thing. I can remember a number of times when we were getting SOX compliant, because that's actually why I joined Intuit in the first place, was to help with the SOX program. I'd have interviews with people and in trying to figure out exactly what was the state of these new controls we were putting in place. And there were folks that were simply not doing what they knew they needed to do. But at no point did they try to cover that up. This is what's happening. This is why. And that kind of trust and honesty is what allows you to then build a comprehensive program. And what it basically comes down to is if the culture of your company is that they don't really care about the success of the company, they're not going to care about the success of the cyber program, and vice versa. If your company really does have that culture of caring about the company, then they're going to care about cybersecurity as well. And it's a much easier lift from that point. So I think Gary and I both had the same experience there, both at SoftBank and Intuit.
That's a great point. And maybe staying with you, Bill, on that. So it sounds like there's also a pretty strong element of the security leadership being able to get the buy-in with proper communication. I shouldn't say proper, but just being able to communicate with the right people, getting the right stakeholders on board. And I think that really leads into the, I believe it's the most recent book that the two of you with Matt Stamper also wrote, the CISO Desk Reference Guide Executive Primer. Mm-hmm. And I read that. I really enjoyed it. I've taken a lot from that because absolutely, and I think everyone should. And just a quick little side note. The reason why I first reached out to you guys is that we have the CISO CISO Desk Reference Guide, volumes 1 and 2 on our shelves at work here. And my CEO is a big fan of yours, so we said I should reach out to you at some point. And I think a lot of people do. I think it's just I think it is something that a lot of people do look at. And so for our viewers here, I'd highly recommend it. And if you haven't read the most recent executive primer, what's interesting about it is I think a lot of security leaders, I'm told, oftentimes run into the same obstacle as how do we actually communicate with our leadership in order to show them, in productive ways that this is important and that this is ultimately going to help you grow the business and grow it safely. And I am wondering, like, how, if you have some just sort of basic tips for that, because you both, part of the fun thing about the Phish Bowl is that I think everybody kind of can come together and talk in like a sports metaphor way. It's sort of a safe way to talk. But I'm wondering how, and Gary, you once gave me you told me that you have the fish tacos and beer approach to getting leadership on board to talk about this and take it seriously. But how do you get that conversation going? How do you get those stakeholders on board to understanding what is a complicated and scary topic and might seem like kind of just a blocker to them as opposed to a growth factor?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to treat your peers who are, in some cases, quite technical, but not technical in the same way, right? And in some cases, not technical at all. But you have to treat them the same way, in a sense, that you treat other people who aren't steeped in your field as well, which is don't create FUD, right? We basically immobilize people when we FUD them, right? So if we talk in highly technical terms, if we talk in gloom and doom terms, if we talk about how the network is about to fall over and never get back up, we're going to get tuned out because that's not problem solving.
I think we lost Bill here.
Yeah, I think he froze. Bill, somebody save Bill.
The second he says FUD, it goes frozen.
Yeah, some other vendors just jumped on it and blocked them out.
Yeah,
that's what it was.
Absolutely. And now they're going to come to me and say, "You never know when your teams will freeze. We can definitely stop that from ever happening to you."
But I think what he's making a point though is, especially when you're dealing with executive staff, I always find, I kind of look at myself as basically being a business executive that manages risk. And I use, people and technology and processes and stuff to be able to get that done. To me, cyber is way more than just the technology. And, I find that when you're talking with, employees, when you're talking with other executives, and if they're non-technical, especially, it isn't that you got to dumb it down for them, but you got to put it in their context. And you got to be willing to go ahead and put it into something that they relate to, so then they can understand the risk that you're trying, to fix, or they understand, okay, there are issues here. I do need resources for this, and it's and I like to say it's an art form. I've known people that are very, very good at it. That I like to mix a little bit of storytelling in it to help people relate and kind of put themselves into that picture and see my point of view. And I try to also see their point of view as well. But I've known people that were exceptionally skilled at it, and being able to go ahead and come in to an audience and figure out, okay, this audience is at this level of ability from a technical standpoint. This is where I need to meet them at. Now let's take them on a journey. And on that journey, as we have a discussion, I'll add in other things and build them up. So by the time we're done, they can see my point of view. I've got their point of view. And in the conclusion, we can see some value of why security is important.
Yeah, it is. Communication is always a kind of a nice mix of your own personal style. And I think that what you, with some strategic aims there, trying to let Bill in as we're talking here. And I think that also what's interesting nowadays is that it seems like cybersecurity is becoming a little bit more of a must-have in leadership, as opposed to just sort of a, like an actual thing that they are starting to embrace as being necessary and maybe even interesting. I don't know. As opposed to before, it might have just been kind of a drag to have to deal with it because it was a blocker to growth. And so I'm wondering if you're able, through different kinds of presentations on what your program is doing, if there are certain things that really do resonate with leadership when you're communicating, whether it's wins, whether it's showing that there's progress being made in places, or whether it's, and if that also can kind of help them get on board with how you're communicating the growing risks and whatnot, as those can happen as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that was honestly, that was the reason why we wrote the executive primer, was that our original books were to go ahead and teach people about being a CISO, and were to also help CISOs mature. Where the primer was to go ahead and teach people like the CFO or the CEO what CISOs do, what security programs look like, so that you can better be able to bring them both together so that they could work together. And a lot of a lot of the purpose around that primer was to be able to bridge that gap. And I've had multiple people that I've spoken with, on executive teams who were, COOs and CEOs who've read the book, and who use the book, and some of them use it as a grading criteria to say, okay, as a CISO, I'm expecting you to be at this level of maturity or to be doing these things. And then I've had fellow CISOs call up, dude, what were you thinking? Now I got my CEO asking me questions about this stuff. But I look at the fact that you've now got the conversation going.
Yeah.
Use it to your advantage. You've now got that FaceTime, and you can have those discussions, that storytelling per se, that go ahead and be able to meet in the middle.
And that's exactly what we wanted to accomplish with the primer, was to actually raise the bar. Raise the bar, not just for how CISOs perform, but raise the bar with respect to what executives expect of CISOs. Right? Oh, I can get this out of a CISO? Oh, that's different. I can have a much better risk posture. I wasn't expecting that before. I could have this much more discipline around these topics. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and you find a lot of times they're very one track when they think of cyber. It's just one thing, and they don't realize it's really a discipline, almost an umbrella of so many different areas. And I have found, executives don't realize CISOs usually are used to wearing 3 or 4 different hats, and they have experience in a lot of multiple fields. And they're, and just as Bill said, wow, I didn't know my CISO could also be a backup for risk and a backup for compliance, and may know, IT as well. They weren't expecting that, or they probably did, but just didn't really think about it until they read our book.
Right. They say that in the old days, the playbook was if there's a breach, then the CISO is kind of sacrificed at the altar of, of PR. But it's kind of like if you have a quarterback who has one bad game sometimes happen. Interceptions happen. You get them back out there, and if you really understand the way that the team works, then you can't just bench the quarterback after one bad game or one unlucky play or something.
Well, it's the same exact calculation, right? It's like, all right, am I better starting my second tier quarterback? Is that going to give me a better chance of winning, or am I better going with the quarterback that just lost the last game for me? It's the same thing with, you can fire the CISO if you want, but the one person who's probably more likely to help you recover from this breach is the CISO. So it's kind of short-sighted, but people are finally starting to learn that lesson.
Yeah, I actually wrote an article about this, and it was all about, CISOs with scar tissue. Do you want a CISO that's never been in a fight, that's never had to go ahead and fight for something? Or do you want a CISO that's got scar tissue because they've dealt with multiple ones? They know what a breach looks like. They know how bad it gets. They know what kind of resources they're going to need. They know the impact on their team and the other teams in the various departments that are going to have to support it. They know what external entities you're going to have to deal with, what regulators you're going to have to deal with. I'd rather want somebody with that type of experience.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, sorry, Bill.
No, I was just going to say, I apologize for my cutout there. I was in mid-sentence and my internet went out.
No problem. Put in some CGI, a little bit of AI there to kind of put your face back there, and we'll make sure that it all kind of comes back together as it was planned.
Awesome. We actually filled in for you. I said that you were talking about FUD, so some other vendors jumped in to stop you.
Awesome.
Yeah. On the topic of FUD and vendors, any recommendations for vendors who might be watching on what they should do with FUD when selling a product?
Well, what I'm expecting to do is in March, I will take my CISO manifesto article and I will update it, and I will update it and release it just before RSA. Because I've been doing it every year now since 2017. So we'll update it. There's some new things to add to it. Chris Robertson's got a couple of good ones that he asked me to add to it. So we'll update it. We'll get it out to everybody just before RSA.
Required reading. Our whole sales staff read that last year, so that was required. Really good stuff. We're actually really nice about it too. It was like it's just good pointers as opposed to
yeah. Well, the thing is, I'm not trying to piss people off. I'm just trying to say, if we're going to be partners, there's a better way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And, you know.
All right. Well, one final note here. So Bill Bonney won the Phish Bowl championship. Bill, you are getting a deep sea fishing trip,
Awesome.
and it's going to be in a very sunny, beautiful location, apparently, because you live in a sunny, beautiful location. So hopefully you two can be on the same boat here too.
I think that's a given. Absolutely. And hopefully Matt will be able to join us as well. So we'll go have some fun. We'll catch a fish for you. Send us some swag. We're more than happy to pose.
Fantastic. Well, the plan is to give you, fantastic. Glad to hear that. The plans get you an actual Phish Bowl trophy. So
awesome.
try and drink some sparkling water out of that one on the boat.
All right. That sounds great. That is really terrific. I'm really thrilled. I've been deep sea fishing, so it'll be a wonderful experience for me. What an interesting way to finish off a season, right? I never did fantasy football before, and I've never done deep sea fishing. So I'll put a couple things off the bucket list.
Cool.
All right. Great catching up with you guys. It's been a great year. Really appreciate you joining me here tonight, and tonight my time, and today your time, and joining me for this fantasy football season. I had a blast. Hope you had a good time as well.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks.
Take care.